In the summer of 1911, Edith Wharton stood on the terrace of the Mount for the last time. She was 49 years old. Behind her, servants moved through the rooms she had designed 9 years earlier, packing books into crates, wrapping furniture in canvas, dismantling a life. Before her, the gardens descended in careful terraces toward Laurel Lake, every hedge planted to her specifications, every path laid according to her drawings. The afternoon sun warmed the stone balustrade beneath her hands. She had chosen that stone herself. This was her house. 42 rooms on 113 acres, white stucco walls rising from fieldstone foundations, an oak-paneled library, gardens that followed Italian principles she had studied in villa after villa across Europe, a bedroom facing east where she had written in bed each morning, watching the light move across the lake. She had designed it all, the first and only house she would ever build, the place where she had written the House of Mirth, the place where she had been happy. Her husband had sold it without her consent. Within weeks she would sail for France and never return to America except once 12 years from now to receive an honorary degree. The woman who had written the definitive book on house decoration was losing her own house to a marriage destroyed by madness, a trust fund emptied by $50,000 in theft, and a heart broken by the first and only love affair of her life. If you find value in this story, please consider subscribing to the channel. To understand why Edith Wharton stood on that terrace unable to save the home she loved more than any of her novels, you have to go back half a century to a cold New York childhood where she learned that home was something you had to create for yourself. Chapter 1. The Girl in the Library. Edith Newbold Jones was not supposed to be a writer. She was born on January 24, 1862 at 14 West 23rd Street in New York City, during the first winter of the Civil War, into a world that had very specific plans for daughters of old money. She would debut in society, she would marry well, she would manage a household and raise children and host dinners where the men discussed important matters, while the women discussed nothing at all. That was the life her mother, Lucretia Rhinelander Jones, had lived. That was the life Edith was expected to replicate. Lucretia was cold, the way marble is cold, beautiful, expensive, and unforgiving. She had married George Frederick Jones when she was young and he was established, and together they occupied the precise social position her family had prepared her for. The Joneses and the Rhinelanders were what New York called old families. They had made their money in real estate decades before, when Manhattan was still small enough to walk across in an afternoon. By the time Edith was born, the third child and only daughter after two sons 11 and 16 years older, the family's position was secure enough that maintaining it required no visible effort. The saying, quote one, was said to refer to her father's family. It was both a compliment and a curse. What Lucretia had not prepared for was a daughter who asked too many questions and read too many books. From the time Edith could read, she disappeared into her father's library and stayed there. George Jones was a quiet man who had inherited his money rather than made it, and his one extravagance was books. He filled an entire room with them, leather bindings, gilt edges, volumes in English and French and Italian. He never forbade his daughter from reading them. Lucretia did. She forbade novels entirely, calling them itself, quote, too unsuitable for young girls. She monitored what Edith read the way other mothers monitored what their daughters ate. But Edith read anyway, pulling down volumes of poetry and philosophy and history when her mother wasn't watching, and her father said nothing. It was the closest thing to rebellion available to a girl of 8. In 1866, when Edith was 4, the family left for Europe. The Civil War had ended, but American currency had depreciated, and living abroad was suddenly cheaper than living in New York. For 6 years, Edith moved through France and Italy and Germany and Spain, absorbing languages the way other children absorb nursery rhymes. She became fluent in French, then German, then Italian. She watched her parents navigate drawing rooms in Paris and Florence, observed the architecture, studied how wealthy Europeans arranged their lives. She nearly died in the Black Forest at age 9 from typhoid fever, burning with fever in a spa town where the doctors spoke a language her parents barely understood. She survived. The family came home in 1872, and Edith was 10 years old and already more European than American. Back in New York, the family divided their time between a house in the city and summers in Newport, Rhode Island, where the real money, the Vanderbilts and Astors, were building mansions that made the Joneses' wealth look quaint. Edith's family was respectable. They were not rich enough to matter. The industrial fortunes pouring into New York made the old real estate money feel small and slightly irrelevant, and Lucretia responded to this shift by becoming more rigid about propriety, more critical of anything that threatened their position. Edith, who wrote poetry in secret and begged her governess for more books, threatened their position constantly. At 16, she published a volume of poems privately. Her parents allowed it because they did not put her name on it. Writing was not an acceptable occupation for a society woman, but a private printing of verses could be overlooked as an eccentricity. Edith understood the bargain. She could write as long as she stayed invisible. Her father died in March of 1882. Edith was 20 years old. He had been her ally, the one person in the house who understood that she needed books the way other people needed air. Without him, the house felt smaller. Lucretia, newly widowed, grew colder. Edith had 2 failed romances in quick succession, engagements that collapsed, proposals that never came. By 1885, she was 23 and approaching what her world called old maid status. Unmarried women became invisible in their society. They lived in relatives' homes. They had no money of their own. They certainly did not become writers. So when Edward Robbins Wharton began courting her that spring, Edith made a calculation. He was 35, pleasant, a sportsman from a respectable Boston family. He liked dogs and travel. He did not, as far as she could tell, read books. But he could give her a house of her own. That seemed, at the time, like enough. Chapter 2. The Marriage of Convenience. Edith Wharton's marriage was over 3 weeks before it began. She married Edward Robbins Wharton, Teddy to everyone who knew him, on April 29th, 1885. She was 23. He was 12 years her senior. The ceremony was proper and brief, and there was no honeymoon. They moved directly into a cottage in Newport that belonged functionally to Edith's mother. Separate bedrooms were arranged from the start. Teddy Wharton had left Harvard after 2 years and never found a profession. He lived on an allowance from his mother, Nancy Wharton, who maintained a modest estate in Boston and a summer house in Lenox, Massachusetts. He was a friend of Edith's brothers, part of the sporting set that filled their days with hunting and sailing and long afternoons spent doing nothing in particular. He was kind. He liked dogs. He could talk about horses and weather and the social calendar with perfect ease. What he could not do was talk about books or ideas or anything that required sustained thought. Edith understood this before she married him. She married him anyway. What they shared was a love of travel. Between 1886 and 1897, the Whartons spent several months of each year in Europe, mostly Italy, with frequent visits to Paris and England. Edith studied architecture and gardens, visiting villa after villa, sketching floor plans, and taking notes on proportion and light. She read voraciously in hotel rooms while Teddy went walking. They were companions in the technical sense. They occupied the same spaces. They did not occupy the same world. In Newport, Edith did what was expected. She made social calls, she hosted dinners, she wore the right dresses and said the right things, and felt herself disappearing into the role her mother had prepared for her. But she was also writing. She wrote poems first, then stories, sending them out to magazines under her own name. Scribner's published one, then Harper's, then Century. Teddy was embarrassed by this. Their friends were embarrassed. Writing was not something women of their class did publicly, but Edith's talent could not be suppressed by embarrassment. Her first short story was published in 1891, when she was 29. It was called Quote 4, and it took her more than a year to publish another. But she kept writing. In 1897, she and Teddy purchased a house in Newport called Land's End. Edith oversaw its remodeling, and in the process of working with an architect named Ogden Codman, Jr., she discovered she had strong opinions about how houses should be designed. Together they wrote a book. The Decoration of Houses was published in 1897, and it became a surprise success. The book argued for something revolutionary in the Gilded Age: restraint. while other wealthy Americans were filling their homes with heavy Victorian excess, overstuffed furniture, dark wallpaper, rooms crowded with ornament. Edith advocated for simplicity, proportion, and classical principles drawn from European architecture. The supreme excellence is simplicity, she wrote. Moderation, fitness, relevance. These are the qualities that give permanence to the work of the great architects. The book made her an authority on house design before anyone knew her name as a novelist. She was becoming someone. The marriage was becoming nothing. By 1899, Edith was publishing regularly. A collection of stories appeared that year, titled The Greater Inclination. She was earning money from her writing, not enough to live on, but enough to matter. Teddy was still living on his mother's allowance, still filling his days with sport and socializing, still unable to understand why his wife spent hours alone in a room writing stories about people he vaguely knew. He receded into the background of her life, present but irrelevant, like furniture in a room she no longer used. She began to suffer from what doctors called neurasthenia, exhaustion, anxiety, difficulty breathing. The diagnosis was common among women of her class, a catch-all for unhappiness that had no outlet. Her physician suggested she write fiction as therapy. She did. The writing made her healthier. The marriage made her ill. What Edith wanted by 1901 was simple and impossible, a house that was truly hers, not her mother's cottage in Newport, not a rented apartment in New York City, a place designed from the foundation up according to principles she believed in. A place with gardens and privacy and a room where she could write without interruption. She wanted to escape Newport, where every afternoon felt like a performance and every dinner required her to pretend she cared about gossip and fashion and the elaborate rituals of people with too much money and too little purpose. In the autumn of 1899, Teddy took her to visit his widowed mother in Lenox. The town sat in the Berkshire Hills of western Massachusetts, a small farming community that was just beginning to attract wealthy families looking for something quieter than Newport. The landscape reminded Edith of Europe, rolling hills, dense forests, lakes tucked into valleys. On a hillside overlooking a lake called Laurel, she stopped and looked out over acres of farmland and woodland, and she saw what she had been searching for all her life: space, possibility. A place to build something that belonged only to her. 2 years later, in 1901, she and Teddy purchased 113 acres of that hillside for $40,600. Edith was 39 years old, 16 years into a marriage that had given her respectability and nothing else. She had published a successful book about how houses should be designed. Now she would design one herself. She would call it The Mount. She would live there for 9 years. And it would be the only place in 75 years of life where she would ever be truly happy. Chapter 3. Building a Sanctuary. In September of 1899, on a hillside overlooking Laurel Lake, Edith Wharton found what she had been searching for all her life. The land sloped down toward dark water and densely wooded shores. The view stretched for miles. The elevation was 1,600 feet, high enough that the air felt different, cleaner, separate from the social obligations waiting in Newport and New York. This was the Berkshires, still rural, still quiet, but beginning to attract the kind of people who preferred conversation about books to conversation about inheritances. Writers were buying property here, intellectuals, people who read. 2 years later, she acted on what she had discovered. The property was farmland, fields and forest and a few outbuildings, and she bought it with money inherited from her mother's estate. She would spend considerably more turning it into a house. She assembled a team carefully. Ogden Codman Jr., her collaborator on the decoration of houses, would assist with the architectural design. Francis Hoppen from the firm Hoppen & Cohen would serve as the project architect. Her niece, Beatrix Farrand, would design the gardens and the drive leading up to the house. Farrand was 29 years old and already one of the most talented landscape architects in America, one of only 11 founders of the American Society of Landscape Architects, and the only woman among them. R.W. Curry would oversee construction, but the primary designer was Edith herself. She had been preparing for this project her entire life. The years spent touring Italian villas and French chateaux, the research that went into the decoration of houses, the remodeling of Land's End. All of it had been training. Now she would apply every principle she believed in to a house built from nothing. The design drew inspiration from Belton House in Lincolnshire, England, a 17th-century country estate that exemplified the classical proportions and restrained elegance Edith admired. But the Mount would be distinctly American, adapted to the Massachusetts landscape and climate. The exterior would be white stucco over brick, set off by dark green shutters and rising from a foundation of rough field stone. The west side, facing the entrance, would be 3 stories. The east side, facing the gardens, would be 2 stories, opening onto a large raised terrace of stone. Inside, every room would serve a specific purpose and reflect that purpose in its design. The gallery on the main floor would be Italian in spirit, light, airy with terracotta tiles and black and white marble. It would display artwork and set the tone for everything else. The library would be oak-paneled, intimate, a room designed for reading and conversation. The dining room would have no square table. Edith hated square tables, and no overhead lights, which she believed destroyed the atmosphere of dinner. Instead, candles and wall sconces would provide illumination. Her bedroom would be on the east end of the house, facing the gardens and the lake. It would have tall windows and morning light. This was where she would write. Every day she would stay in bed with a writing board across her knees and let pages fall to the floor as she finished them. The room would be her sanctuary within the sanctuary. The house would contain 42 rooms in total, not as many as the Newport mansions, but more than enough for comfort. 16,850 square feet, a gatehouse and stable in the Georgian Revival style, a greenhouse with a potting shed. Staff quarters for a cook, housekeeper, and maids, 8 bedrooms in the service wing. This was not excess. This was careful, deliberate design, every element chosen for proportion and function, rather than display. Beatrix Farrand designed the gardens according to Italian principles: formal terraces descending from the house, an enclosed kitchen garden, a lime walk, flower gardens with specific color schemes, grass terraces that opened onto views of the lake. Privacy was essential. Edith wanted to be invisible from the road, hidden from casual observation, free to work without the constant awareness of being watched. Construction began in 1902. The cost was $57,619, substantial but not extravagant by the standards of Gilded Age estates. Everything was overseen by Edith with Beatrix at her side. They walked the property together, discussed plantings, adjusted plans. This was collaboration between aunt and niece, between 2 women who understood that a garden was not decoration but structure, as important to a house as its walls. By October of 1902, the Mount was complete enough to occupy. Edith moved in with Teddy and an initial staff. The furniture was arranged. The books were shelved in the library, hundreds of volumes in English, French, Italian, German. The gardens were planted, though they would need years to mature into the vision Edith had drawn. The house smelled of fresh plaster and new wood and possibility. Edith was 40 years old. She had a house of her own design, built on land she had chosen, arranged according to principles she had spent years refining. She named it the Mount, after her great-grandfather Ebenezer Stevens's estate in New York. In her autobiography written 3 decades later, she would describe it simply, quote, 7. She called it her first real home. She had no way of knowing she would have it for less than a decade. Chapter 4. The Golden Years. Every morning at the Mount began the same way. Edith woke before sunrise, stayed in bed with her writing board across her knees, and let the pages fall to the floor. She wrote in bed because it was comfortable, and because the morning light through the east-facing windows was perfect, and because no one interrupted her there. Her small dogs, she always had several, curled at the foot of the bed. The view stretched across the formal gardens to Laurel Lake. By 11 o'clock, the pages scattered on the floor would be collected and brought to her secretary for transcription. By then, Edith would be dressed and ready for the rest of the day, walking the grounds, working in the gardens with Beatrix, managing the household, or entertaining guests in the library. The rhythm of life at the Mount suited her completely. The house ran smoothly because she had designed it to run smoothly. The staff knew their roles, the rooms functioned as intended. The gardens matured into the vision she and Beatrix had planned. Terraces of flowers, carefully pruned trees, paths that revealed views at precisely the right moments. Everything worked, and she was writing better than she ever had before. In 1905, 3 years after moving into the Mount, Edith published The House of Mirth. She had written it in the bedroom overlooking the gardens, and it was the first novel that felt entirely hers. No tentative voice, no hesitation, just a clear-eyed examination of New York society and the way it destroyed women who could not adapt to its demands. The protagonist, Lily Bart, was beautiful and intelligent and utterly trapped by the rules of her world. The novel ended with Lily's death, and readers understood it was the only escape available to her. The book became a massive success. It sold 140,000 copies in its first year. Edith's old Newport friends were horrified. She had exposed their world, satirized their values, made clear that she saw through the elaborate performances that passed for social life. They distanced themselves from her. She did not mind. The success made her wealthy and famous. More importantly, it confirmed what she had always believed. She was a writer, and a serious one. She continued to produce work at a remarkable pace. The Fruit of the Tree followed in 1907. Short stories appeared regularly in magazines, essays on travel and architecture, book reviews. The bedroom at the Mount was a factory of words, and everything that came out of it was sharp and polished and uncompromising. Teddy, meanwhile, managed the grounds. He oversaw the farm operations, supervised the staff who maintained the buildings, and spent his afternoons hunting or fishing or riding. He was happiest outdoors, occupied with physical tasks that required no intellectual effort. Edith's success made him uncomfortable in ways he could not articulate. She was becoming famous. He was becoming the husband of someone famous. The difference mattered, but for 5 years, it worked. They lived parallel lives that occasionally intersected at dinner or when guests arrived. And the guests were extraordinary. Henry James came often. He had been corresponding with Edith since 1902, and their friendship deepened into something essential for both of them. James was 20 years older, already one of the great novelists of the age, and he treated Edith as an equal. He called the Mount, quote, 8, which was both accurate and slightly condescending, but Edith understood that condescension was how James expressed affection. They walked the grounds together, discussing character and structure and the difficulties of getting American readers to care about psychological complexity. They sat in the library reading to each other. They argued about technique with the kind of intensity that only two serious writers could sustain. Theodore Roosevelt visited and stayed for dinner. They discussed politics and conservation. Roosevelt was passionate about preserving wilderness, and the Berkshires reminded him of the landscapes he wanted to protect. Egerton Winthrop came, and Bernard Berenson, the art historian. Writers and intellectuals and people who understood that the Mount was not just a house, but a working space, a place where serious things happened. Dinners were served in the dining room without overhead lights, just as Edith had planned. The round table accommodated 10 comfortably. Conversations ranged across literature, politics, art, travel, the subjects Edith cared about, the subjects her Newport friends had found tedious. Here, she was surrounded by people who read books and had opinions about them, and the difference was everything. Afterward, they would move to the library or the terrace. In summer, they would watch the sun set over the lake. In winter, they would sit by the fire. Edith's telescope stood on the terrace, and sometimes they would spend hours looking at stars. James making elaborate metaphors about celestial mechanics, while Edith pointed out constellations. This was the life she had built, a house that worked, gardens that bloomed on schedule, friends who understood her, work that mattered. For 5 years, from 1902 to 1907, Edith Wharton had everything she needed to be happy. The Mount gave her space to write, freedom to think, and the companionship of people who valued the same things she did. But in the autumn of 1907, two things happened that would destroy everything she had built. Henry James brought a visitor to dinner, a journalist named Morton Fullerton, and Teddy Wharton, whose father had spent 10 years in a psychiatric hospital before dying of melancholy, began to show signs that the family illness had passed to the son. Chapter 5. The Inheritance of Madness. Mental illness ran in the Wharton family like a curse no one spoke about. Teddy's father, William Craig Wharton, had spent a decade at McLean Hospital in Boston. He had committed himself to the psychiatric facility sometime in the 1880s, around the time of Teddy and Edith's wedding. The symptoms were vague in the way symptoms often were when families preferred not to examine them too closely. Depression and inability to get out of bed. Long silences. Eventually, William stopped speaking at all. His death certificate listed the cause as melancholy. Family correspondence suggested suicide, though no one said the word directly. He was a cloud over the family, present even in absence. Teddy inherited more than his father's trust fund. The early years of his marriage to Edith had been marked by what doctors called neurasthenia, exhaustion, nervousness, and inability to settle. Edith had suffered from the same condition, but in her case, it improved when she wrote. In Teddy's case, nothing improved. The diagnosis was convenient and vague, a way of acknowledging distress without naming its source. Depression sounded too serious. Madness was unthinkable. So doctors called it neurasthenia and prescribed rest and travel and keeping busy. The Mount was supposed to help. Edith's physicians encouraged her to keep Teddy occupied with farm management, with overseeing the grounds and staff. Meaningful work, they said, would stabilize him. For several years, it seemed to. He spent his days outdoors, supervising repairs and plantings, managing the livestock. He was competent at these tasks. They required no deep thought, only attention and routine. But by 1907, the routine was not enough. Teddy began having episodes. He would be fine for weeks, pleasant and cooperative, and then something would shift. He would become agitated, unable to sleep, convinced that people were conspiring against him. Or he would sink into depression so profound that he could not leave his room. The mood swings accelerated. What had once been a bad week became a bad month. Then several months. Edith would return from a trip to find him worse than when she left. Doctors examined him and used new terms: megalomania, manic depression. They said his condition was probably hereditary, that his father's illness had reappeared in the son. They said it was incurable. Teddy's behavior became more difficult to manage. He shouted at servants. He accused Edith of things that made no sense. He had episodes of hysteria, wailing, pacing, unable to control himself. Visitors to the Mount began to notice. Henry James, in a letter to a friend, described Teddy as, quote, 10 quote. The phrasing was James at his most delicate, but the meaning was clear. Teddy was losing his mind. The arguments between Edith and Teddy happened mostly in her bedroom, where she wrote each morning. Staff reported hearing shouting, the sound of objects being thrown. Some visitors, years later, would say they could still feel the energy of those fights lingering in the room. Edith never wrote about these confrontations directly, but her fiction from this period, stories of trapped marriages and impossible choices, suggested what she could not say explicitly. By 1908, doctors confirmed what Edith already knew: Teddy's mental illness was incurable. He would have good periods and bad periods, but the trajectory was decline. The question was what to do with him. Institutionalization was one option. Separation was another. Staying together while Teddy deteriorated was a third, and the one that seemed most likely. Edith began spending more time away from the Mount. She traveled to Paris, stayed for months, returned only when necessary. The house that had been her sanctuary felt increasingly like a trap. Teddy's presence made it impossible to work. His illness made it impossible to predict what any given day would bring. She loved the house and hated what it had become, a stage for a marriage dying in public. performed before staff who tried not to notice and guests who noticed everything. The irony was not lost on Edith. She had built the Mount to escape the oppressive social rituals of Newport. Now she was trapped in something worse, a home she could not leave without abandoning a man who was sick through no fault of his own, and a marriage she could not save because the person she had married no longer existed. In Paris, she met people who understood her as a writer and an intellect. She attended salons and dinners where the conversation matched what she had at the Mount when guests visited. And in the autumn of 1907, at one of these dinners, Henry James introduced her to Morton Fullerton. Fullerton was an American journalist, 42 years old, working as the Paris correspondent for the London Times. He was charming and well-read and knew everyone worth knowing. James thought Edith would enjoy talking to him. What neither James nor Edith anticipated was what would happen when a 45-year-old woman in a sexless marriage met a man who paid attention to her in ways her husband never had. At the Mount, Teddy was unraveling. In Paris, Edith was falling in love. And back in Massachusetts, her husband was about to betray her in ways she never imagined possible. Chapter 6. The first and only time W. Morton Fullerton was exactly the kind of man Edith Wharton should have avoided. He was handsome, sophisticated, well-connected, and famous for seducing people, both women and men, and then disappearing without explanation. At the time Edith met him in the summer of 1907, Fullerton was living with a former mistress who was blackmailing him, conducting an affair with another woman, and engaged to his adopted sister. He made his living as a journalist, but his real occupation was collecting powerful friends and discarding them when they stopped being useful. Henry James knew all of this and introduced Fullerton to Edith anyway, possibly believing that two intellectuals would enjoy each other's conversation, and nothing more. Edith was 45 years old. She had been married to Teddy for 22 years. She had published 7 books, remodeled 2 houses, designed a third from scratch, established herself as one of America's most important novelists, and experienced physical intimacy approximately never. Her marriage to Teddy had been sexless or nearly so from the beginning. The 3 weeks before consummation had set the pattern for everything that followed. Whatever happened between them in private remained private. But Edith's letters and diaries from later in life made clear that she entered middle age without any understanding of her own body or what it was capable of feeling. Fullerton changed that. The affair began slowly. He offered to help her publish a French translation of The House of Mirth. They corresponded about literature and publishing. Edith returned to Paris in 1908, and the correspondence became dinners, and the dinners became something else. By late 1908, Edith was keeping a secret diary, pages she never intended anyone to read, pages discovered decades later in her papers at Yale. In those pages, she wrote about desire and confusion, and the overwhelming sensation of feeling something after years of feeling nothing. She described Fullerton as her ideal intellectual partner, which was true, but incomplete. He was also the first person who made her understand what novels meant when they described passion. At 46 years old, Edith Wharton experienced sexual pleasure for the first time. The affair was conducted in secret. Edith was still married, still maintaining appearances, still worried about scandal. Fullerton was also maintaining several other relationships simultaneously, though Edith did not know this yet. They met in Paris apartments, tried unsuccessfully to arrange a weekend away, wrote letters that were careful and coded, and increasingly desperate on Edith's side. She was also entering menopause. Her body was in upheaval, hot flashes, insomnia, irregular cycles. At the same time, she was experiencing physical desire for the first time. The combination was overwhelming. In her diary, she wrote about feeling, quote, 12, quote, and, quote, 13, quote, at discovering how much she had missed. How, quote, 14. She had spent decades building a controlled, disciplined life. Fullerton shattered that control in months, and then he pulled away. It was his pattern, though Edith did not recognize it at first. He stopped answering letters. Weeks would pass without contact. Edith would write pleading with him to explain what she had done wrong, and he would send a brief note saying he was busy, and then disappear again. On August 26, 1908, she wrote, Quote 15. The letter was desperate in its restraint. She did not want to seem hysterical. She wanted to seem reasonable, mature, someone who could handle an adult relationship. But the silence continued. She confided in Henry James, who tried to mediate, making excuses for Fullerton and suggesting Edith be patient. But James knew Fullerton's history. He had been through this before with other people. The pattern was always the same: intense attention followed by withdrawal, affection replaced by indifference, presence replaced by absence. Edith was experiencing what dozens of others had experienced before her. By April of 1910, she was writing, "I am sad and bewildered beyond words, and with all my other cares and bewilderments, I can't go on like this." And later, "My life was better before I knew you. That is, for me, the sad conclusion of this sad year, and it is a bitter thing to say to the one being one has ever loved d'amour." The affair ended the way Fullerton's affairs always ended. He moved on. He kept her letters despite her request that he destroy them. Years later, he would sell them, betraying even the memory of what they had shared. But the affair changed Edith's writing permanently. Before Fullerton, her novels had been technically accomplished but emotionally distant, precise observations of society, intelligent examinations of social constraint, but missing some essential understanding of human desire. After Fullerton, everything shifted. She began writing Ethan Frome in 1910 as the affair was collapsing. The novel was set in the harsh Berkshires winter, among characters trapped by poverty and isolation and impossible choices. It was about a man who loved the wrong woman and destroyed both their lives trying to escape with her. It was far more passionate than anything Edith had written before, and passages appeared in the novel that came directly from the diary she had kept for Fullerton. The Reef followed in 1912, written immediately after the final break with Fullerton. It was tightly focused, intensely psychological, about the failure of romance and the impossibility of knowing another person. Summer came in 1917, a novel about sexual awakening that critics called shocking. And in 1920, Edith published The Age of Innocence, a novel about longing and loss and the love that never happens, and won the Pulitzer Prize. Fullerton had broken her heart. But he had also taught her something essential about what people felt when they wanted each other and could not have each other. He had made her a better writer by making her a more complete person, even if the cost was years of pain. Back at the Mount, Teddy's illness worsened. While Edith was in Paris falling in love and having her heart broken, Teddy was falling apart in Massachusetts. And in his madness and desperation, he did two things that would end the marriage forever. He took a mistress, and he stole $50,000 from his wife's trust fund to pay for her apartment in Boston. Chapter 7. $50,000. In 1909, while Edith Wharton was in Paris mourning her lost love, her husband was buying an apartment in Boston for his mistress with her money. The theft was not discovered immediately. Teddy had access to some of Edith's accounts. She had left him money for the upkeep of the Mount and other expenses while she traveled. He took considerably more than that. $50,000 disappeared from her trust fund over the course of several months. Teddy used the money to speculate in real estate, lost most of it, and spent $16,000 purchasing an apartment where he installed a woman whose name Edith never mentioned in any letter or diary that survived. When the embezzlement was discovered, Teddy's defense was incoherent. He claimed he had intended to make money to surprise Edith. He claimed the woman meant nothing. He claimed he could not remember making some of the transactions. His mental state made it impossible to determine what was illness and what was deliberate betrayal. The doctors said megalomania. The lawyers said theft. Edith said the marriage was over. She had tolerated the mental illness. She had tolerated the mood swings and the hysteria and the verbal abuse. She had kept their problems private and maintained the appearance of a functional marriage even as Teddy deteriorated. But theft was different. Adultery was different. These were not symptoms of illness. They were choices, made in moments of clarity or madness, but choices nonetheless. The trust was gone. In the summer of 1909, Teddy's mother, Nancy Wharton, died. Teddy, at 59 years old, finally received his inheritance. It should have brought relief, his own money at last, independence from the allowance he had lived on his entire adult life. Instead, it triggered a manic episode worse than anything that had come before. He became convinced he was wealthy beyond measure. He bought things impulsively. He talked about grand plans that made no sense. The inheritance that should have stabilized him accelerated his decline. But the money did allow him to repay what he had stolen. In 1910, when Edith returned to the Mount for what would be the last time, Teddy gave her back the $50,000 in full. He sold property. He used his inheritance. He made restitution. It did not matter. The marriage was over. Edith sold the Park Avenue apartment in New York that had been their winter home. She could not afford to maintain both that property and the Mount on her writing income alone. Teddy's trust fund had paid for their lifestyle. Without it, the financial reality was stark. The Mount required a full staff, constant maintenance, property taxes, and operational costs that exceeded what Edith earned even with the success of the House of Mirth. She could keep the house, or she could keep working as a writer. She could not do both. She leased the Mount to a family named Shattuck in 1909. Albert and Mary Shattuck had been looking for property in Lenox since their own house, Brookhurst, had burned down in 1905. They were cultured, refined, Francophiles like Edith. They agreed to lease the Mount with an option to purchase. The arrangement was meant to be temporary, a way for Edith to reduce costs while she figured out what to do about Teddy and the marriage and the increasingly obvious fact that she could not return to live in America while Teddy was still there, still unstable, still unpredictable. By 1910, Teddy had been placed in a sanatorium. The doctors said long-term institutionalization might be necessary. Edith was spending most of her time in Paris, where she could work without constant interruption, and where the literary society understood her as a serious artist rather than a curiosity. She returned to the Mount in the summer of 1910 to pack some belongings. It was the last time she would see the house. In 1911, the Shattocks offered to purchase the Mount outright. The price was $180,000. Edith agreed. She had no choice. She could not maintain it. She could not live there. Teddy, who was nominally still her husband and had joint ownership, completed the sale. He did so while Edith was traveling in Italy and France. She received a letter informing her the transaction was complete. Once again, he had acted without her full consent, though this time the lawyers assured her everything was legal. In the summer of 1911, Edith returned to the Mount one final time to supervise the packing. Servants moved through the rooms boxing her books, all 2,600 volumes from the library, every book she had carried to this house believing she would read them here for the rest of her life. The furniture was wrapped and crated. The artwork came down from the walls. She was dismantling everything she had built, piece by piece, room by room. The beds where she had written, the library where Henry James had read aloud, the terrace where they had watched stars through the telescope. All of it was being taken apart and sent to storage or sold to collectors or shipped to Paris, where she would live in an apartment that belonged to someone else. She stood on the terrace one afternoon while the packing continued inside. The gardens descended in perfect terraces, every hedge and flower bed placed according to the plans she and Beatrix had drawn 9 years earlier. The lake stretched out below, dark and still. The stone balustrade was warm under her hands. She had chosen that stone. She had specified its placement. She had designed every detail of this view. Within weeks, she would sail for France and never return to live in America. The divorce from Teddy would be finalized in Paris in April of 1913, ending 28 years of marriage. She would never build another house. And when she wrote her autobiography in 1934, at the age of 72, she would write 5 words that captured everything she had lost. It was only at the Mount that I was really happy. Chapter 8. The War Years. Edith Wharton never went home again. She settled in Paris in 1911, taking an apartment at 53 Rue de Varenne that belonged to George Vanderbilt. She was 49 years old and starting over. The divorce from Teddy was not yet finalized. That would take until April of 1913, but the separation was complete. Teddy returned to Lenox, living in his mother's house on Walker Street. Edith stayed in France and never seriously considered returning to America except for brief visits. The first years were productive in ways that surprised even her. She published Ethan Frome in 1911, the novel she had written while the affair with Fullerton was ending, and her marriage to Teddy was collapsing. Critics called it her masterpiece, stark, tragic, and more emotionally direct than anything she had written before. The Reef followed in 1912, a psychological study of failed romance. The Custom of the Country appeared in 1913, serialized in Scribner's magazine, the same month her divorce became final. The novel satirized American social climbers and the nouveau riche with a ferocity that made her earlier work look gentle. The writing was good, but it did not make her happy. She missed the Mount. She missed the routine of mornings in bed overlooking gardens she had designed. She missed the physical space that had been hers and only hers. The apartment in Paris was rented. The life she had built there was borrowed. She worked because she had always worked, but the work felt different without a home to contain it. Then in August of 1914, the war started. Germany invaded Belgium. France mobilized. Within weeks, Paris transformed from a city of cafes and salons into a city preparing for siege. Most Americans living in Paris fled to England or returned to the United States. Edith stayed. She was wealthy, famous, recently divorced, and living in her favorite city in the world. She could have left. She chose not to. Instead, she threw herself into humanitarian work with an intensity that bordered on obsession. If she could not save her marriage or keep her house, she could at least do something useful. She established workrooms for unemployed seamstresses, women who had lost their jobs when the fashion houses closed and the wealthy families evacuated. She opened convalescent homes for tuberculosis sufferers whose treatment had been interrupted by the war. She created hostels for refugees flooding into Paris from Belgium. She founded schools for Belgian children whose families had fled the German invasion. The work consumed her. She raised money from wealthy Americans, coordinated with French government officials, managed staff, visited the facilities she had established, and wrote letters constantly, begging for donations, requesting supplies, arranging transportation. Her network of charities became a complex operation, employing hundreds of people. She called one organization the Children of Flanders. Another was the American Hostel for Refugees. She kept meticulous records, wrote detailed reports, and ensured that every franc was spent efficiently. But Edith did not stay in Paris managing paperwork. She wanted to see the war herself. Through her connections with French officials, she arranged to visit the front lines. This was extraordinary. Journalists rarely got access to combat zones. Civilians almost never did. Women were explicitly forbidden from most areas near fighting. But Edith's work with refugees and her fundraising efforts had made her valuable to the French government, and they granted her permission to visit. Between 1915 and 1916, she made 5 trips to areas near active combat. She saw ruined villages, trenches filled with mud and soldiers, hospitals overwhelmed with wounded men. She walked through towns that had been shelled until nothing remained but rubble and the occasional standing wall. She talked to soldiers who had been at the front for months without relief. She took notes constantly, observing everything with the same attention to detail she had once applied to Italian villas and Berkshires gardens. She wrote about what she saw for Scribner's magazine. The essays were published throughout 1915 and collected in a book called Fighting France, From Dunkirk to Belfort. The writing was clear and unsentimental, descriptions of destruction, accounts of conversations with soldiers, observations about the psychological cost of trench warfare. She did not romanticize what she saw. She made it clear that war was not glorious or redemptive, but simply terrible, and that the people enduring it deserved support from those who were safe. The book sold well in America, where opinion about the war was divided. Edith used her platform to argue that America should enter the war on the side of France and Britain. She believed German militarism needed to be stopped, that civilization itself was at stake. She wrote essays making this case. She gave speeches at fundraisers. She lobbied American officials visiting Paris. When America finally entered the war in April of 1917, Edith felt vindicated. In 1916, the French government awarded her the Legion of Honor. She was the first American woman to receive it, and the ceremony was formal and emotional. The medal recognized her humanitarian work, her fundraising, her trips to the front lines, and her writing about the war. It was one of the highest honors France could bestow on a civilian. But the honor did not make the war less exhausting. By 1918, Edith had been working at an unsustainable pace for 4 years. She was managing multiple charities, writing constantly, traveling to inspect facilities, and dealing with the endless bureaucracy of wartime France. Her health began to suffer. She developed respiratory problems. She lost weight. Friends worried she would collapse. The war ended on November 11th, 1918. The armistice was signed, and Paris erupted in celebration. Edith stood in the streets watching people dance and cry and embrace strangers. She had spent 4 years trying to alleviate suffering that should never have happened. The war's end brought relief, but not happiness. Too many people had died. Too much had been destroyed. The world she had known before 1914 was gone, and nothing would bring it back. In 1919, exhausted and 57 years old, Edith moved out of Paris to a suburban villa in Saint-Brice-sous-Forêt. The house was called Pavillon Colombe, and it would be her primary residence for the rest of her life. It was not the Mount, but it was hers. Chapter 9. The later years. The Age of Innocence was published in 1920, and it was a novel about the world Edith had left behind. Set in 1870s New York, it followed Newland Archer, a man engaged to a respectable young woman, while falling in love with her scandalous cousin Ellen Olenska, who has fled a disastrous European marriage. Archer is trapped between duty and desire, between the world he knows and the life he wants. The novel ends with him choosing duty and Ellen leaving, and both of them spending the rest of their lives wondering what might have been. The book was Edith writing about her own past, the rigid social world of her childhood, the impossible choices women faced, the cost of breaking rules in a society that permitted no deviation. But it was also about loss and longing, and the recognition that some chances, once missed, never return. Critics praised it as her finest work. Readers loved it. In 1921, Edith won the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction. She was the first woman to receive the award. She was also not particularly pleased about it. The Pulitzer Committee had initially planned to give the prize to Sinclair Lewis for Main Street, a novel Edith admired. At the last moment, the committee overruled its own judges and selected The Age of Innocence instead, apparently believing Lewis's novel was too critical of American values. Edith understood she had won not because her novel was better, but because it was safer. She accepted the award because refusing it would have been ungracious, but she never claimed it was a triumph. In 1920, Edith also purchased a second property in France, Château Saint Clair, a restored convent in Hyères, in the south, near the Mediterranean. For the rest of her life, she divided her time between Pavillon Colombe outside Paris and the Château in Provence. She gardened at both properties, wrote in both houses, entertained friends who visited from England and America and across France. She traveled often, Italy, Spain, Morocco, always observing, always taking notes, always writing. She published prolifically. Twilight Sleep in 1927, Hudson River Bracketed in 1929, and its sequel, The Gods Arrive, in 1932. She wrote ghost stories, essays, literary criticism, and travel books. She edited an anthology called The Book of the Homeless to raise money for war refugees. She corresponded with Bernard Berenson, the art historian, who had become one of her closest friends. She maintained friendships with writers and intellectuals across Europe. But people she cared about were dying. Henry James had died in 1916, before the war ended. His death had devastated Edith. He had been her mentor, her friend, the person who understood her work better than anyone. Walter Berry, her oldest friend and possibly the great unrequited love of her life, died in 1927. She felt his loss acutely, though she never wrote about the nature of their relationship explicitly. Teddy died in 1928, following the same path of depression that had killed his father. Edith had not seen him in years. In 1923, Edith returned to the United States for the last time. She came to receive an honorary doctorate from Yale University. She was the first woman Yale had ever honored in this way. The ceremony was formal, the speeches were laudatory, and Edith spent less than 2 weeks in America before sailing back to France. She did not visit Lenox. She did not drive past the Mount. She told friends that she could not bear to see the house as a stranger, owned by people she did not know, occupied by lives that had nothing to do with her. She continued writing into her 70s. Her autobiography, A Backward Glance, was published in 1934 when she was 72. The book covered her childhood, her marriage, her friendships, and her career. But it said nothing about Morton Fullerton and very little about the emotional realities of her life. It presented a sanitized version of her history, carefully edited to protect privacy and avoid scandal. But in one passage, writing about the Mount, she allowed herself to be direct. It was only at the Mount that I was really happy. 5 words, written 3 decades after she lost the house, a simple statement that revealed everything she had spent the rest of the book concealing. On June 1st, 1937, Edith suffered a heart attack while working on a revised edition of The Decoration of Houses at Pavillon Colombe, the book that had made her famous 40 years earlier, that had led her to design the Mount, that had established her as an authority on architecture and taste. She was revising it when her heart stopped. She recovered enough to continue working through the summer, but her health declined rapidly. On August 11, 1937, she suffered a stroke. She died at 75, surrounded by staff and a few close friends. She was buried in the Cimetière des Gonards in Versailles, next to Walter Berry. The funeral was small and private. Obituaries around the world praised her as one of America's greatest novelists, the first woman to win the Pulitzer Prize, an author who had defined an entire era of American literature. None of the obituaries mentioned that she had also designed one of the most beautiful houses in the Berkshires and lost it to a marriage that destroyed both people trapped inside it. None mentioned that she spent 26 years in exile, writing novels in France about a country she never returned to. None mentioned the 5 words she had written in her autobiography that told the real story, the one about happiness found and lost and never recovered. What Edith did not know, could not know, was that the Mount would survive her by decades, and that its story was far from over. Chapter 10. After Edith the Mount survived Edith Wharton by 65 years before anyone tried to bring her back to it. The Shaddocks owned the property from 1911 to 1938. Albert and Mary Shattuck were cultured people. He was a merchant banker who had made a fortune in New Orleans before moving to New York, and they had summered in Lenox since the 1880s. They maintained the Mount well, treating it as the country estate it was designed to be. They hosted guests, tended the gardens, preserved the basic structure of Edith's design. But tragedy followed them. In 1922, while living in Paris, they were victims of a home invasion. French gangsters broke into their apartment and held them at gunpoint. The Shaddocks survived, but 2 years later, Albert was murdered in Paris by the same gang. Mary returned to the Mount as a widow and lived there until 1938, when she sold the property to the Van Anda family. The Van Andas kept the Mount for only 4 years, using it as a private residence but making few changes. In 1942, the entire property was sold to an institution that would occupy it for the next 3 decades, the Fox Hollow School for Girls. The school converted the Mount into a dormitory and classroom building. Fire escapes were bolted to the exterior walls to meet safety codes. Interior walls were modified to create more bedrooms. The main living room ceiling, an elaborate plasterwork design Edith had commissioned, was carefully photographed, then dismantled and moved downstairs to make room for institutional changes. Someone had the foresight to document the sections before removing them. The documentation would prove essential decades later. The gardens, which Edith and Beatrix Farrand had designed with such precision, were neglected. Without constant maintenance, the formal beds became overgrown. The tiny shrubs Edith had planted grew into 20 and 30-foot trees. The lime walk disappeared under vegetation. The terraces eroded. During the school years, students reported strange experiences, voices in empty hallways, footsteps on stairs when no one was there. The most persistent stories centered on a rumor that a servant had hanged herself in the cupola after discovering she was pregnant. True or not, the story became part of the Mount's folklore. Girls whispered about seeing figures in Victorian dress moving through rooms. They heard muffled sounds they could not explain. In 1971, while still operating as a school, the Mount was designated a National Historic Landmark. The recognition was based on Edith's literary significance and the house's architectural merit. But designation did not mean preservation. The building continued to deteriorate. The school closed in 1976. Enrollment had been declining for years, and the property was expensive to maintain. That same year, the farmhouse and surrounding meadow were sold separately to the towns of Lee and Lenox, becoming part of a conservation area. The main house and 49 acres were purchased by a developer named Donald Altshuler, who also bought the adjacent Westinghouse estate. He planned to build condominiums. Lenox resisted. He built them on the lee side of the property instead. The Mount itself sat vacant, deteriorating, with an uncertain future. In 1978, everything changed. A theater director named Tina Packer founded Shakespeare and Company and moved the troupe into the Mount. The company needed space for rehearsals and performances. The Mount needed someone to occupy it before it collapsed entirely. The arrangement benefited both parties. Actors lived in the building, rehearsed in the rooms, performed on the grounds. Their presence arrested the immediate decline. But Shakespeare and Company was a theater troupe, not a preservation organization. The house was used hard. Performances were held in gardens that were already overgrown. Rehearsals happened in rooms that needed structural repair. The building served its purpose, but that purpose was theatrical, not historical. In February of 1980, the National Trust for Historic Preservation's Endangered Properties Program took an option to purchase the Mount from Altshuler. The price was $290,000. Shakespeare and Company raised $143,000 toward the purchase. In May, Edith Wharton Restoration Incorporated was officially formed, with Lila Burrell as its first chairwoman. The organization's mission was to preserve the Mount and restore it to something approaching its 1902 condition. Initially, the relationship between Shakespeare and Company and Edith Wharton Restoration was cooperative. The theater needed space. The preservation group needed the house occupied. Both organizations shared a commitment to keeping the Mount alive. But over time, conflicts developed. Shakespeare and Company focused on performance needs, stages, lighting, audience access. Edith Wharton Restoration focused on historical accuracy, original materials, period-appropriate restoration, scholarly research. The competing visions were documented in a 252-page internal report that chronicled years of tension. Shakespeare and Company left the Mount in 2001, moving to a new facility they had built nearby. The departure left Edith Wharton Restoration in control of a property that had been used intensively for 2 decades with minimal maintenance. The house was in terrible condition. The gardens were unrecognizable. Decades of institutional use, theatrical productions, and deferred maintenance had reduced Edith's masterpiece to a shadow of what it had been. But at least it still stood. And in 1997, Edith Wharton Restoration had begun the work of bringing it back. Chapter 11. Bringing Her Home. In 1997, restoring the Mount looked impossible. The buildings were crumbling. Fire escapes scarred the exterior. The interior walls needed replastering. Trim required complete rebuilding. The main ceiling was in storage, photographed in sections, waiting to be returned to its original location. The gardens were lost under decades of overgrowth. What had once been carefully maintained flower beds and precisely trimmed hedges were now tangled masses of vegetation. Everything Edith had designed was still there technically, but buried under years of neglect. Edith Wharton Restoration committed to a full restoration. The project would cost millions. It would take years. It would require architects, conservators, landscape specialists, historians, and an enormous amount of research. Every room needed to be returned to its 1902 condition, or as close as possible. The gardens needed to be replanted according to Beatrix Farrand's original plans. The furniture was gone. Edith had taken everything with her in 1911, so period-appropriate replacements would need to be acquired or commissioned. By 2002, the main house was complete enough to open to the public. World-class interior designers had been invited to decorate the rooms, using her principles from the decoration of houses as guidance. The result was not a recreation of how the house looked in 1911, but an interpretation of how it might look if Edith were furnishing it again today. The library held books. The dining room had a round table and wall sconces. The bedroom on the east end had a bed where visitors could imagine Edith writing each morning, pages falling to the floor. In 2005, President George W. Bush presented the Mount with the Preserve America Presidential Award. That same year, the restoration of the formal gardens was completed at a total cost of $13 million. The terraces descended toward the lake again. The flower beds bloomed on schedule. The lime walk was cleared and replanted. Visitors could walk through gardens that looked nearly identical to what Edith and Beatrix had created a century earlier, but operating a historic house museum is expensive. Annual costs reached $2 million. There was no endowment. Revenue from admissions and events covered some expenses, but not all. Edith Wharton Restoration was spending $300,000 more per year than it was bringing in. The deficit accumulated. In 2006, an opportunity arose that the board could not refuse, but could not afford. A British book dealer named George Ramsden owned Edith's personal library, the 2,600 volumes that had been removed from the Mount in 1911 and sold to a London collector. Half the books had been destroyed during World War II. The remaining volumes were now available for purchase. The price was $2.6 million. The board debated for months. The library would complete the Mount's authenticity in a way nothing else could. These were Edith's actual books, with her signature on the flyleaves, her marginalia in the margins, her bookplates from Land's End and Pavillon Colombe and Hyères. The oldest volume was from 1528. The newest were from the 1930s, acquired just before her death. They represented her intellectual life, her influences, her reading habits. Having them back would be extraordinary, but the organization was already in financial trouble. Robert Wilmers, head of M&T Bank and a Berkshires summer resident, loaned the organization $2.5 million at a low interest rate with a 2-year repayment deadline. The purchase was completed. The books were returned to the library shelves after 95 years, and the debt deepened. By 2008, Edith Wharton Restoration owed $8.5 million to various creditors. The largest was Berkshire Bank, which held the mortgage on the property. Payments were missed. The bank threatened foreclosure. Executive Director Stephanie Copeland resigned. Susan Whistler took over as executive director and inherited a crisis that could end with the Mount being sold at auction. The irony was almost too perfect. Edith had lost the Mount to financial problems in 1911. Now, nearly a century later, after millions spent on restoration, after the library had been reacquired, after the gardens had been replanted, the Mount was about to be lost again. Whistler and the board launched an emergency fundraising campaign. They raised nearly $2 million in 2009, including an $800,000 grant from the J.M. Kaplan Fund. The debt was restructured, but not eliminated. The organization limped forward month to month, trying to balance preservation with survival. In September of 2015, after a year-long fundraising effort, Edith Wharton Restoration announced that the debt had been paid in full. All $8.5 million. The Mount was financially stable for the first time since the restoration began. Whistler, in an interview, said she felt, quote, 21, quote, the house that Edith lost was finally, permanently saved. Today, the Mount welcomes more than 50,000 visitors annually. It is open seasonally from May through October, with the grounds accessible year-round from dawn to dusk at no charge. Tours are offered throughout the day. The house looks much as it did when Edith lived there. The gallery with terracotta tiles, the oak-paneled library with 2,600 books on the shelves, the dining room without overhead lights, the bedroom facing east where morning light pours through tall windows. Visitors can sit in the rooms. They can walk through the gardens. They can stand on the terrace where Edith stood in 1911, looking out over the lake one last time. The Mount also functions as a cultural center. The Edith Wharton and Straw Dog Writers Guild Writing Residency brings 9 emerging writers to the property each March for 1-week stays. They sleep in the house where Edith wrote, walk the grounds she designed, work in the same rooms where The House of Mirth and Ethan Frome were written. Lectures, readings, concerts, and theatrical performances happen throughout the season. Outdoor sculpture exhibitions are installed in the gardens. The property partners with more than 40 local organizations to present programs on literature, history, architecture, and design. The house that Edith Wharton built in 1902 and lost in 1911 now stands as a monument to her vision. She designed it according to principles she believed in. She lost it to circumstances she could not control. She spent 26 years in exile, believing she would never see it again. She died without knowing it would be preserved, restored, open to the public, recognized as one of America's great houses. The tragic story of Edith Wharton is this. She built a perfect house, lost it through betrayal and circumstance, and died believing it was gone forever. But the true story, the one she never got to know, is better. The house she loved survived. The gardens she designed with Beatrix bloom every summer. The library holds her books. The bedroom where she wrote overlooks the same view she saw each morning. And every year, 50,000 people walk through the room she created, read the books she read, and understand at last why she wrote those 5 words in her autobiography. It was only at the Mount that she was really happy. The mansion that cost her everything gave her 9 years of happiness and took 75 years after her death to become permanent. She never knew, but the house knew. And now, everyone who visits knows the Mount is still here, and so is she. The Mount teaches us something that Edith Wharton spent her life trying to articulate. Houses are not just structures, they are ideas made permanent. Edith believed that good design could create the conditions for good living. She believed that proportion and light and carefully considered space could shape how people thought and worked and experienced daily life. She spent years studying architecture, wrote a book about design principles, and then built one house that embodied everything she believed. She lived there for 9 years. She lost it to circumstances she could not control. She spent the rest of her life in exile, writing novels about longing and loss, never knowing that the house she loved would outlive her by a century. What saved the Mount was not nostalgia or sentiment, but the recognition that Edith's ideas were worth preserving. The people who fought to restore it, Lila Burrell, Stephanie Copeland, Susan Whistler, and dozens of others, understood that they were not just saving a building. They were preserving a way of thinking about design, a commitment to beauty and function, and the belief that how we arrange our lives matters. They spent decades and millions of dollars bringing back gardens and plasterwork and proportions. They went into debt to reacquire Edith's library. They nearly lost everything to foreclosure. They persisted anyway. The result is a house that functions exactly as Edith intended. Visitors walk through rooms designed for conversation and reading and work. Writers stay in residency programs, sleeping in the same house where Edith wrote The House of Mirth. The gardens bloom according to Beatrix Farrand's plans. The library holds the books Edith read and annotated and carried with her from house to house across 2 continents. The Mount is not a museum frozen in time. It is a working example of principles that remain relevant. Simplicity, proportion, attention to light and space, and how rooms connect to each other and to the landscape beyond. Edith Wharton built a house that cost her everything, but the house survived because what she built was not just walls and gardens. It was a demonstration of how to think about design and why good design matters, and what happens when intelligence and discipline and vision are applied to the question of how we live. That idea could not be destroyed by foreclosure or institutional use or decades of neglect. It waited, and when people finally understood what they had, they brought it back. If this story resonated with you, consider sharing it with someone who understands that preservation is not about nostalgia. It is about recognizing which ideas deserve to survive.